Hello folks, StephenGray here, and you are probably aware you're watching the StephenGray Vision YouTube channel or listening to this on Anchor.fm, that's ANCHOR.fm, or one of the places it sends its audio podcasts to, such as Spotify and iTunes. The purpose of this series, and this one is slightly different. Most of what I've been doing is interviewing leading lights, visionaries, leading figures in the psychedelic world, as it were, with an overarching intention to share information which will hopefully help shift humanity onto a sane, sustainable, reality-based, you might say, path or trajectory, which clearly overall it is not, or we are not at the moment. So I won't go on about that theme, but that's what a lot of these interviews have been about. However, this one is just me with me. And it's because I interviewed a remarkable person this morning named Laurel Sugden, who is, you will see on the StephenGray Vision YouTube channel series shortly, or actually by the time you see this, it'll probably already be up sometime in early 2021, January 2021. Right now it's December 29th, 2020, the third last day of this calendar year, and one that everybody says is very strange. But let's leave that. It speaks for itself for most of us. What I wanted to do, since I had already taken the time to set up all this material, I've got two lights here, two mics, all these different things, so I thought, well, it's already up, got my green screen going. I will share some thoughts on cannabis and meditation together. Cannabis meditation, you might say. It's the theme of my book, Cannabis and Spirituality, and by the way, when I say my book, that's a slight overstatement. I'm the editor, sort of project coordinator, and I contributed 3 or 4 chapters to it, but there are 17 other contributors, so it's our book more than just my book. Anyway, the purpose of that book was to share information and inspiration on ways that people could understand cannabis, ooh, I like that, yeah. Cannabis as a spiritual ally, a vastly underappreciated capability of this plant for most people, although this is changing rapidly. Hallelujah. Perhaps for those of you who haven't read the book, don't want to take the time or spend the money to buy the book, it's available in Kindle and audiobook form as well, or would just like a reminder, having read the book or having thought about this subject a bunch, here are a few ideas that might help you understand and particularly put to work or put to practice ways of working with cannabis in conjunction with meditation, or you might say, as I said, cannabis meditation. So I'm going to go through a few things that I hope will be helpfully over the next half hour or so, roughly. First of all, I want to make a disclaimer. I don't think that cannabis is the only way that one can do meditation, by no means whatsoever, in case anyone's wondering that. I once had a young man ask me, do you ever meditate without cannabis? And I said, yeah, mostly without cannabis. Excuse me, at that time I had a regular daily practice, now it's off and on, of just sitting without cannabis. However, different things happen, or the same things happen amplified on cannabis. There's a few ways to talk about that, and I'll get into that a bit. So I just want to clarify, I don't believe this is the only way to meditate by any stretch, or the only path by any ridiculous stretch of any kind, okay? So I just want to point out really briefly, in case you're not familiar with this concept or this notion, this is not something new, okay? Cannabis has been around. The lineage of cannabis has probably been on the planet somewhere between 30 and 90 million years, long, long before us, of course. And its use for everything has been in place, or it has been used for just about anything you can imagine since so-called civilization, and long before what we would identify as so-called civilizations as well, I imagine, with Homo sapiens and perhaps even some of our similar related human ancestors, Neanderthals or whatever. No doubt The record is a little slim, in sort of pre-recorded history, but there's definite indications that cannabis was used for spiritual practice, for meditating, for going deep, etc., going way back, 10, 12,000 years probably. Certainly, once you get within a couple of thousand years of what's now called the Common Era, used to be called the Christian Era, excuse me, there begins to be record. For example, the sadhus of India claim that they are the originators of Hinduism. Well, I won't argue with any scholars that say that's not true, but some sadhus have said that. And for example, there's a lineage of the naked sadhus, whose guru was a guy named Haripuri Baba, I believe, and he said, yoga is stopping the chatter of the mind. And this is a cannabis using or ganja using group. So when they're talking about stopping the chatter of the mind, they're talking about using cannabis to deepen the potential if you are able to stop this, quote, chatter of the mind, right? So I want to say a little bit about meditation when I say cannabis meditation or cannabis and meditation. There are, of course, many kinds of meditation. First of all, we're not talking about contemplation. That's a different thing. That means to think things over, etc. Meditation, it's a kind of an odd word because some people say, well, I'd like to meditate on that. And what they really mean is contemplate on it. So meditating in this sense is just being present. And again, there are lots of kinds. There are visualization practices and chanting practices, and so on and so on. Even a lot of the asanas, or the hatha yoga asanas, could be considered a kind of meditation. But the one I want to draw your attention to, this is the purest, the simplest, the most universal, the most sort of non-practice meditation practice of all of them. It's the simplest. It's, as I say, not even a practice on some level, is what you might call, or what has been called, emptiness meditation, or bare attention meditation, or formless meditation, or just simply paying attention, which doesn't even necessarily require you to sit down to do. However, sitting down has its distinct advantages because you're essentially clearing away all other distractions and things that could get in the way, or you're not having to bring in even different brain regions. If you're doing yoga, there's some degree, oftentimes, perhaps this is arguable, of brain activity, in the sense that you have to think about what you're doing or what practice you're going to do next, and so on, and move that body a little bit. If you simply sit still, this is why all that Buddhist iconography and Hindu iconography from millennia shows people sitting still with a straight back and so on. So when we're talking about meditation, the purest, most direct, most potentially powerful way to meet cannabis in meditation is through a very simple sit down, shut up, and pay attention kind of meditation. That's sort of a borrowed line from Terence McKenna, credit where credit is due. And so you don't have to do anything fancy about it. We're not talking about full lotus or anything. This is not about, quote, holy practice. It's about getting yourself into a place in the environment, and external and internal environment, where you can meet the plant fully and allow it to do what it can do for you, or with you, I guess you could say. And I'll get into that a little bit more as I go along here. So when I say not a particularly special, unusual kind of practice, all we're talking about is it's really valuable to sit straight. Allow the spine to be straight so that energies move well, okay? And so that it helps, actually, believe it or not, if you're not used to it. I know a lot of people aren't used to sitting straight. It's kind of a weird thing. They'd rather just sit back and go, yeah, and they think that's relaxing. But strangely enough, once you get used to it, if you haven't done it much, once you get used to sitting with a straight spine, relaxed, with an open front, but a straight, firm spine, whether it be on a cushion or a meditation bench or even in a chair, if you're not comfortable sitting, on the floor, so to speak, then that, as I say, allows the energies to move, the Kundalini energies to move freely up and down, the meridians to be aligned, that kind of thing, okay? So beyond that, doesn't really matter much, in my view, what you do with your hands, as long as you do something with them so you're not kind of fidgeting, etc., right? And then this is the way the Buddhist meditation practice was taught to me. It's called shamatha practice. And there are lots of variations on this one, but this is a good basic one. You just sit straight, as I say, and you put a gentle attention on your breath. When I say gentle, like you don't hyper focus on it or anything like that. You can have your eyes open or closed, and then because the breath is like the most real thing that's going on, in a sense. There's nothing more real than your breath, right? It's happening 24 hours a day, whether you're awake or asleep. It's part of the autonomic nervous system, right? So it's an anchor. It's a beautiful way to anchor oneself back into the present, okay, into this real moment of being right here. And that's what real spiritual practice is about, in my view, and the view of many others, frankly, is that it's not about becoming something else or being a totally different person. It's about learning how to be right here, fully present, with as little distracting thought, you might say, as possible. Eckhart Tolle had a beautiful way of putting that very simply. He said, ideally, the relationship you want to develop with your thinking mind, I think he just called it your mind, is you want to be able to treat it as a tool that you can pick up when you need to use it. But if you don't need to use it, you can actually put it down and just be there and just pay attention to what's going on around you. Slow your sort of turmoil and speed of mind down, right? So this is where the deepest potential of working with cannabis is, because what cannabis does, pardon me, I'm getting ahead of myself slightly. So the practice is you pay attention to the breath, and then inevitably what will happen is thoughts will come up. And that's really interesting, because in Buddhist teachings and others, it's recognized that thinking thoughts is what obscures awakening, obscures basic non-conditional or unconditional reality, okay? So there's nothing wrong, nothing wrong with thinking per se when we're using it in that way that Eckhart Tolle talked about as a tool. But when it controls us, we're using it as a smokescreen and keep us obscured from reality, or reality obscured from us, so to speak, then that's more problematic. And so what will happen is thoughts will come up inevitably, and in that kind of practice, you just release them. You might even say, notice, acknowledge thinking or whatever, and then come back to this relatively gentle attention on the breath and just being there, right? Now, it's really important to understand with cannabis, too, is because so many people understand that cannabis is a creative stimulant, and it is for a lot of us. And so, and it also amplifies, or you might even say puts a shine on thought. So you get into some kind of thinking and you get lost in it or self-absorbed in it, and you think it's amazing or it's compelling, whether it's positive or negative. And that's a potential problem too, because it's like a neutral amplifier, a non-specific amplifier. And so if you're having self-sabotaging thoughts, they can be amplified and exaggerated out of all proportion. So that's an issue to pay attention to. So in this practice, it's not about paying attention to the thoughts. It's, they may seem like the most amazing thoughts you've ever heard or had. I mean, and so in this practice, even if you just do it for 15, 20 minutes, half an hour, we're thinking a lot of the time. We don't need to bring that into this practice, right? Ideally. So thoughts come up, you notice them, you let them go. There are other ways of working with cannabis where you consciously go into, a thought package as a gestalt, as a kind of like an exploration, and let it play itself out. And when it's done, come back to the wellspring of sitting in silence. But for the purest meditation, and it's the hardest thing to do, actually, and this is why it's so valuable, because it is really difficult for us human beings to let go of the thinking mind, especially those of us of these so-called modern cultures, there's the basic practice, okay? And then the next principle is, again, it's not about necessarily having sensational experiences or wonderful insights or anything like that. A term that I like, it's a cliche now, but I like it anyway, it applies to this, is there's no there. In a sense, we're not trying to get somewhere else. That's what we've been doing all along on some level. What we're aiming to do in this way of working with cannabis, and just as a universal practice, so to speak, is we're aiming to just be more here. Okay, so when I've described cannabis as a non-specific amplifier, what it can do is, if you can get yourself into this, so-called right place where you can be present and allow some space in the thinking mind, then it's just deepening this already existing reality, just deepening your connection to it. And it's not something, I don't think, I could talk about this later, but it's not something you can do all the time. I don't think it's good to do it all the time for most people. There are some reasons not to be trying to do that, and also it has a distinct diminishing returns effect if you're doing it all the time. So I think it's good to have a regular practice of meditation. Again, it's barely a practice. It's actually a way of living, like to just allow your mind to be as spacious as possible when you're just going through your day. The meditation of washing the dishes or walking to the corner or whatever, like, do you need to be thinking all the time? No, probably not. So it's a way of life more than anything. And cannabis, I would say, working with cannabis as a meditation tool that way is something that you dip into to keep the connection alive, as a reminder in a sense, and practice that helps spill over into the other kind of meditation or post-meditation practice you might do throughout the day. All right? So maybe it's a little bit helpful, if you haven't read the book or haven't thought too much about this, to just go through a couple of little suggestions for how you might actually practice, like, kind of hands-on, flexible template, so to speak. So for individual practice, again, it's about, good to be rested. When you do this, good to have a quiet, undisturbed environment. They talk about set and setting. Set is the intention you come in with, essentially. That's a very simple way of putting it. And setting is the actual environment where you do whatever it is. And, nice to have it, clean, uncluttered. Maybe you like to have a little altar. Everyone's different that way, so however it works for you, And then it may be good, especially if you're not used to sitting like this or not used to working with cannabis like this, it may be good to give yourself a time commitment, like take your phone and put it on alarm for half an hour from then, Just commit yourself to stick with it, so that when you get that amazing thought, then you want to go, oh boy, that's amazing, wonderful, I want to do something with that, or oh, I'd love to hear that song right now. Cannabis stimulates passions and desires a lot too, which makes it potentially very challenging to just sit and calm with for a lot of people as well. So if you give yourself 20 minutes, half an hour to do it that way, then you're not going to necessarily indulge in that sudden impulse, right? So, and then dosage and strain can be very important. What I often say about the what I would call the optimal dosage is depends on how deep you want to go and how much you can handle. So you could start very light and just have a little bit of calmness, which might help with just that calm presence meditation, or you can really go for it. There's a term in Portuguese for working with ayahuasca. They call it a força, the force. Sometimes you really want to go for that force, but if you find that you're dizzy, weirded out, anxious, nauseous, anything like that, then that's too much. And it often is. A lot of people have had experiences with cannabis where they just go, oh my God, that was horrible. And some of those people never come back to it. So if you are new to working with cannabis in this way, and slight disclaimer, not disclaimer here, but tangent, that's sidebar, that's what we'll call it. if you have not worked with cannabis in this way, if you've always been doing something like talking with friends, listening to music, thinking, writing, whatever you're doing, if you're engaged in activity, you are very unlikely to notice the real power of cannabis. Like if you were to have, like, say, two exactly the same amount of tokes with the same cannabis in the same basic state, rested, whatever, and one of them you're doing a bunch of things, and the other one you're simply sitting there, there's a very good chance, and I'm speaking from experience, that you're going to go, when you do the silent sitting part, you're just going to go, oh my God, I had no idea how strong this plant could be, right? So it's good to start small, I think, especially if you don't know the strain, that particular cultivar, and especially on top of that, if you are a sensitive person in general, a cheap date, as they say, right? So start small. You can always have a top up even like 10 minutes later, because if you sit still with it, you'll notice its effects pretty much immediately. And although sitting still and breathing will actually, just in the same way that they would deepen meditation anyway, they will quite likely deepen your experience over a few minutes or so, or maybe even longer. There's a good chance that by about 10 minutes, you'll know that, okay, I'm not going any stronger here, right? So then you could have another toke or whatever. So that's a good way to do it. And then strains, cultivar, that can be really important. I was just looking at leafly.com the other day, and they had like a number of their contributors were saying their favorite strains, or what they consider the best strains of 2020, and there were descriptions of each one, and some people are saying, there's a lot of strains that I can't relate to, but this one here, right? So you may want something that is kind of clear, uplifted, maybe not too edgy in some ways, depending on you and your metabolism and all that kind of thing. Not something that's going to make you feel kind of heavy or want to sink back in the couch, particularly something that's going to allow you to be awake, very awake with it. And that you just have to find on your own, right? You have to look around. Like Washington State, for example, I think is good. I'm up here in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, where they haven't quite figured out how to gain access to a lot of the small growers. I think they might have done better in some of the American states, where you can just go home with 4 or 5 different strains, and or cultivars, as some people like to call them, and try them out. And then, find one that you really like. I should say a word about what you might call routes of administration or methods of intake. Obviously, there's smoking, there's vaporizing. Some people would say, and I agree with them in general, that it's a little sharper. I prefer smoking to vaporizing. I do both a lot, or, I balance it, depending on the situation. But if I want a sharper, deeper experience, I will tend to go with smoking. And then there's the whole thing of edibles, and that's a whole different story. They don't come on with that sharp burst out into clear air. They take up to 2 hours to reach full effects, especially if you've eaten somewhat recently. So really important. Most people watching this probably know this, but it's really important to be careful with edibles, especially if you haven't tried that particular strain, or whatever, brownie, or whatever it is before. Make sure that you start small, because you very well may have heard some real horror stories. I'm not exaggerating. Where people, they want to call 911. They think they're having a heart attack or something like that, or you just feel like you're stuck in some place you can't. It's scaring the shit out of you for 5 hours or whatever. So, however, some of the ancient traditions, in India, when they talk about having these really powerful spiritual experiences, they are talking about taking it internally, like in a bang lassi or whatever, So just things to explore with altogether. I also want to mention briefly cannabis in conjunction with other plants, other plant medicines, other psychedelics, I guess you could say. And this is Well, I think of cannabis as an advanced spiritual practice, actually, because of, it's hard enough for most of us to meditate and stay present and not be in our thoughts a lot anyway. Because cannabis is an amplifier, it also raises the stakes, which can be quite challenging. And then if you combine it with something like psilocybin mushrooms, for example, you're upping the ante a lot more at that point. But that can be really useful if you know what you're doing. If you're familiar with the psilocybin and the dosage and the context you're doing it in, and you're familiar with that particular strain, cannabis can function as you might say, a kind of a humble adjunct to potentiate, to empower, to strengthen the effect of the other medicine. And that can be quite effective. Lots of people have reported that. Can sharpen things up. It can even calm them down without diminishing the effect of the other medicine. So that's something potentially useful as well. I'm getting near the end of this, and I want to mention that there are some things that people need to be cautious about. One is dependency. So you've heard about cannabis as being potentially addictive, and I want to make it clear that physiologically, in the way that something like alcohol or cigarettes, heroin, and a few others are very much physically addictive and are extremely difficult to withdraw from. Cannabis is not particularly addictive that way. I compare it roughly to the level of addictiveness of coffee. If you've been smoking heavily for a long time, of course, there's going to be some brain changes that are going to take a while to work out. But if you've, say, smoked, I don't know, a couple times a week for 5 years or 10 years and you suddenly stop, I don't know. I can't promise you what will happen or not, but I suspect that at worst you might have your sleep patterns disrupted slightly for a few days or whatever. You might be a little irritable. You might have some headaches for a couple of days. But let's put aside this notion of cannabis being addictive in that sense. However, I don't want to go into it in detail here. It's in the book and it's in other places as well. Psychologically, cannabis can be very problematic because this non-specific amplifying effect can take people into places that they find kind of comforting, I suppose, in one way. And so it can be used as an escape from, as Kathleen Harrison in my book talks about, from relationship and responsibility, from engagement in life. And she's an elder, a psychedelic elder, and has observed over the years that it's often young men who, kind of want to get into their man cave, metaphorically and perhaps literally, and not come back out from. And that can be very deleterious to the people around you, to the relationships that you're engaged in. So, she in that sense, cannabis, although I wouldn't put it on her to say she's seductive, but the results can be very seductive. The reality of it can be very seductive. It's like, oh, I really like this place, and you keep wanting to go back for it. But it's almost like the more you go back for it, the more it rebuffs you in that way. And there are also some. Well, I've been doing a little bit of research, not a huge amount, but there's some evidence, it's not clear yet, so they do know that cannabis affects the dopaminergic system, or it works on dopamine receptors. And there are some studies that indicate that heavy long-term use of cannabis can result in dopamine production in the brain being reduced, which makes sense. This is, I believe, something vaguely like this is what causes the addiction factor with something like cocaine, where the brain it's getting a flood of these chemicals, and so it's not at some point it's not producing them itself, and so when you don't have it, there's depression. So there can be depression and some other unwanted effects from heavy use, something to pay attention to, perhaps, okay? There's a fellow named David Krantz, you might look him up, Krantz, or Z, who has been talking about, has been doing studies with the genetics and found that cannabis has very different effects on people, different people depending on their genetic makeup. Some people are going to be more simpatico with it than others, of course. Just something you might look into. I would just say, though, as an overarching point on that issue, that a lot of people who think that cannabis is not for them, it's not because of something like genetics. It's because they have not used it in these ways where, some people, it takes them into places where they don't like their thinking. Totally understandable. But if you don't buy into that thinking, just like in, quote unquote sober meditation practice, and you just let those thoughts go and come back to the breath, cannabis is an energy medicine. It's a body medicine. It potentially brings us back into being able to let go, to be able to release and open up that way. Okay? Yeah, so I could have said a few more things about how cannabis actually works, a little bit about the pharmacokinetics of it, but I think I want to leave this one here, except for I just want to say, and a couple of people in the Cannabis and Spirituality book have chimed in on this one and called cannabis the sacrament of peace. The potential sacrament, you might say, for the universal religion of the future, the non-denominational, non-hierarchical, non-exclusive, find your own empowerment kind of religion or spiritual practice of the future. Of course, we have these other entheogens and other kinds of practices, but there's something universal about cannabis that in communion with people and just even on one's own, when it's used really effectively that way, that can bring peace, can bring open-heartedness and calmness. And my God, this world needs a lot of calmness. So I hope this has been useful for you. A lot of what I've said in this last half hour is elaborated upon in the Cannabis and Spirituality book. Another really good recent book for yoga folks, very recent, is a friend and colleague of mine, Chris Killam, Kilham, has just published a book called The Lotus and the Bud. Excellent book on combining cannabis and yoga. So, be well, serve the whole as much as you can, please.